Do you want to check out ITProTV but aren't ready to commit? We're making a few episodes from our most popular courses free for you to try here on YouTube so you can see what they're all about. Enjoy this episode and head over to itpro.tv when you're ready to see the full course.
Hello, and thank you for watching ITProTV, helping you level up with IT learning everywhere you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. And this episode is Introduction to Linux. And I can think of no other person to tell us about that than Don Pizzette, and he's right here. Don, good to have you.
Hey, glad to be here, Zach. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the Linux operating system, which is really what this whole series is about. But if you're new to it, it's actually very different than a lot of other operating systems that are out there. So we're going to take a look at a little bit of the history. Where did Linux come from? Who created it? What's the design methodology behind it? These are all different things that we really need to understand about the software to make effective use of it and to see kind of how everything lines up throughout the whole rest of the course. So that's what's going to be coming up right here in this episode.
Well, great, Don. And, first of all, I want to say you look like Sherbert with the background we have here. It looks wonderful. But tell us about the history of Linux. Who created it? How did it start?
Well, at a high level, it's a computer operating system, right? We can install it on our hardware and allows us as humans to interact with the hardware. And so that's what it does. But how it was created is actually a little bit different than a number of the other operating systems that we run. If you're familiar with Microsoft Windows and Apple's Mac OS or OS 10, depending on which version you're running, those operating systems were developed by commercial companies, generally to make money, right? That was kind of their goal. With Linux, it's a little bit different because it was created to be free from the very beginning. In other words, they didn't set out to make money on this. In fact, the actual origins of it are pretty interesting. It was created by a gentleman named Linus Torvalds, and he was a student in a college in Finland. And at the college, they used a number of computers there that were running an operating system called Minix. And Minix was based on another operating system called Unix. Now, Unix was developed by AT&T, and which is the American Telephone and Telegraph or whatever, the phone company here in the United States. And Unix was a commercial operating system. You had to pay for it. It had heavy licensing to it. So it wasn't something that just anybody could run. Minix was also a commercial operating system at the time, although it's free now. But back then it was a commercial operating system. And Linus was working on Minix machines at the university. And what he wanted was to be able to go home at the end of the day and use an operating system that was similar to what he was using at school. But he was a college student, didn't want to pay a ton of money, and just decided, you know what? I'm going to create my own. I'm going to create my own operating system that's very similar to Minix. And because Minix was very similar to Unix, most people describe the Linux operating system as Unix-like, that it's similar to Unix. And the name of Linux comes from simply combining Linus's first name with Unix or Minix, depending how you want to look at it, to create the Linux name for that operating system. Now, this all happened back in 1991, and that's the early days of public internet access for most people. Back in the early 1990s, it was mostly universities that had access to the internet and the military. Now, everybody has access to the internet. But back then, there were message boards that people would post to and communicate on. They were called Usenet servers. And a lot of those old communications are still archived and available from various vendors. So before the show, I actually went on to Google's archive, and they have the original posting that Linus Torvalds made in one of the Usenet groups announcing his new operating system. So I've got it pulled up right here. And basically, it's just a simple post. And put yourself in his place, right? You're a college student. You just came up with this idea. You've been working on it for a few months, and now you want to tell people about it. And he says, hello, everybody out there using Minix. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU, for 386 and 486 AT clones. This has been brewing since April and is starting to get ready. I'd like any feedback on things people like or dislike in Minix, as my operating system resembles it somewhat. Same physical layout of the file system due to practical reasons, among other things. And then he goes on to say some of the things that he's ported over to it, like the bash shell, GCC, which is the GNU C compiler, and various other utilities that people would need. So this is him telling the world about this new operating system, and this was posted back in August of 1991. He said he'd been working on it since April, so you figure about 4 months into the project, and he announces it out. So this is where it all started. And from here, people answered him. People said, hey, I would like to see this one feature. I'd like to see that one feature. And it started to get added. It started to evolve, and it started to grow. all right from that little entry. And it's kind of funny going back because he even puts a little note in here. The very last sentence is, it is not portable, which I never noticed. He actually spells that wrong, but uses a 386 task switching, et cetera. And it probably never will support anything other than AT hard disks, as that's all I have. Well, we know now, here 30 years later, that one, it is portable now, runs on a number of different architectures, and it supports way more than just AT style hard disks. And I'm sure Linus can actually afford many, many different types of disks, but he's now supported by thousands of developers the world over. And so the operating system is insanely mature. Some of these original comments, like, this is just a hobby, it won't be big and professional like GNU. Well, GNU is kind of dwarfed in comparison to what Linux has become over the years. So it really evolved, but you can kind of see the humble origins of it right here captured in this one post.
So it seems like you stressed free in the post as well. Why do you stress that so much?
So there's actually a whole big political school of thought behind all this stuff. And I usually try not to get involved in the politics side of things. And Linus really didn't either. He just said, look, I want to be able to go home at the end of the day
Hmm.
and run an operating system where if I create software on it, I'm unencumbered by licenses and restrictions and things like that. So for example, if you want to write software, and you decide that you're going to write it in a computer language that's controlled by one particular vendor, like back then you might write something in Delphi, which was owned by Oracle, you actually had to pay a license to Oracle for that compiler to be able to run the software. And then if you wanted to redistribute that and share it with other people, you might be encumbered by that license. In fact, you might even have to charge more to cover the licensing for your end users. So lots of challenges came about with that. And so part of the benefit of creating an operating system from scratch was that he could make it where there was no encumbrance, that you had the freedom to do whatever you want. Now, that whole world is super confusing. And the term free is something that a lot of people misunderstand because there's another term that gets batted around called open source, right?
Ah, yes.
And open source is not the same as free. So let's try and clarify all this. When we talk about free software, I've got a little diagram here. There's four different actions that we can do with software, right? If I give you a program, right? You can view it. That just means you can look at it and run it and use it yourself, right? You can view maybe the source code, or maybe you can't. Maybe it's just the software itself. You might have the ability to modify it. You can actually change the software, tweak it to make it to your own benefit. The Linux kernel, for example, you can download a copy of it right now, and you can modify it, change it, make it work your way. It's all available. Copy it. I've got one copy. I want to give Zach a copy, so I duplicate it and I give it to him, right? You can't do that with Microsoft Word or
Mhm.
Mac OS. You're not allowed to copy it and share it. Those are licensed and controlled. And then distribute, that means to share it with other people. I guess I kind of blended copy and distribute. So if I had three computers that were all mine, I could copy between them and then distribute when I give to someone else. So these are kind of four different activities. Now, when we talk about free software, if I give you software that is genuinely free, you can do all four of these things. You can view the software, use it, most likely access the source code. You can modify it to your heart's content. You can copy it and you can distribute it. If we do anything to encumber the software in any way, in any of these four categories, then it's no longer free. And at that point, it becomes either commercial or restricted software. And that's a big challenge because a lot of developers, they want that freedom to be able to create their own product and distribute it out there and share it and so on. So free is really important, and that's why Linus stressed it in the post. Now, I mentioned open source, and open source is a little bit different. Let me do a different diagram here. So with free software, that's really a social movement. It's a feeling, a moral set of values that
A
people
culture.
align with. Yeah, a culture.
Yeah.
People want to be able to share what they've created and do it in a way that doesn't put restrictions on people,
Mhm.
right? So this is all built around the idea of user rights, what you are allowed to do. That's what free software is all about. All right. Open source is different. Open source isn't about social rights and people's whatever. Open source is actually designed to help you improve your code, to improve your product, right? There's a gentleman named Richard Stallman who is a big supporter of free software. He's involved with a number of organizations like EFF and OSS and all those guys. And so he's out there pushing a lot, and he's always trying to help people understand the difference between these two. And he actually wrote a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar that lays out a lot of this stuff. But on the open source side, any company may have a staff. Let's say Zach, you and I, we come up with an idea. We
Mhm.
say, all right, we're going to write an app.
Right.
What kind of app are we going to write?
We're gonna write an app that helps people look for shoes.
All right, so we're going to create a shoe shopping app. This is going to be great. And
Not
so
buy them, just look for them.
So, being open source software or being free doesn't mean we have a good idea. It just means we have an idea, right? So then we decided to create an app,
Uh-huh.
right? Now, if you and I decided to write it,
Mhm.
well, I don't know how to write an app.
I
I
do
don't
not
think you
know
know.
how to write an app.
All
No.
right, so we don't have the knowledge to do it, but
No.
we could try. We could go and buy a book, start to learn to
Mhm.
code, start to write the app, right? But we're limited to our knowledge.
Right.
But if I posted it online, here's all the source code to my app. I could let other people take a look at it, right? They could examine that code, get an idea of how it's working, and they could give me suggestions. They could say, "Oh, Don, there's a mistake right here. You probably want to fix that." Or the way you're doing that's really inefficient. Here, let me give you a suggestion. Or I want to use your app also, but I'm going to make it better this way, and I'll share the way I made it better with you. That's what open source is all about. By
Mm.
sharing the source code, by letting people peek under the hood of your application, they can give you suggestions and advice and even make improvements themselves, and you end up making your product better, right? That doesn't mean you're giving them the rights to freely distribute the software. There's actually a number of open source products that don't allow redistribution, and there's a number of them that actually have clauses in there that say you're allowed to use this source code as long as you don't make money for it. It's
Right.
only available if you do it for free. That's encumbering somebody. That's restricting somebody. So even though you're forcing them to be free, it's not technically free. The fact that you forced them makes it not free. So you've created your own rules. So that's a big difference. Now, in the Venn diagram here, in the middle, we have view, modify, distribute, copy. Those are common elements between both sides.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
there is a difference between free software and open source software. And that's where you'll hear people say, like, Linux is free and open source. They'll say both, right? They won't just say it's free or it's open source because it's actually two different things, free and open source. There is a license, the GNU public license or the GPL, that defines that freedom and ensures the ability of people to be able to use that code and freely distribute it. So it's a weird world. There's a lot that's involved in it, but that's why you see that stress so much on the free status of the software.
Don, did Linus write the entire operating system for Linux?
This is a common misunderstanding, right? So, if you were to go and talk to Linus Torvalds
Yeah.
today, right, which I've never talked to him, so I'm just assuming, but if you ask him, did you write the Linux operating system? He's going to say something like, "What is the Linux operating system?" Because Linux isn't an operating system. Linux is actually a kernel, and a kernel is a small piece of hardware or of software that allows programs to talk to hardware, right? The Linux kernel is actually, I mean, it'll fit on a floppy disk easy. It's usually less than a megabyte in size, maybe a little bit more. It's a very small piece of software. And in the beginning, yes, Linus wrote that. He wrote it
Mhm.
all himself. 'Cause you saw in his post, he
Mhm.
started the project by
Now
himself.
you got some input from other people as well, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
But not just input, not just people with suggestions. He had people giving him software too. Like, hey,
Oh.
you need something to navigate the file system. Here, let me give you this program that already does it. So you don't have to write it from scratch. You can just use my program that's already written. And so what a kernel does is allow that other software to talk to the hardware.
Mhm.
The kernel by itself is actually useless. If you take a computer and you just put the Linux kernel on there, you're not going to see anything on your screen. You're going to type on your keyboard and nothing's going to happen. It's useless, right? You need software stacked on top of that. And so with Linux, there's a whole set of software that gets stacked on top. So in this diagram here, you can see, when we say Linux, most people are actually wrapping two things together: the Linux kernel, which is what actually runs on our hardware, and then the GNU software that runs on top of it. Now, GNU is kind of an interesting thing.
It's a beast that lives in Africa, Don.
The GNU or new or however you say
The
it,
news.
or wildebeest, is that the
GNUs.
same thing?
GNUs.
Well, either way, GNU. It actually stands for. This is going to sound silly, but it stands for GNU is not Unix, and it goes. Yeah, the acronym is actually in the definition, but it goes way back to Unix was a commercial operating system you had to license, and so somebody, in this case, a lot of the early work was done by Richard Stallman, wanted to create a set of tools that allowed you to operate as if you were on Unix, but in a free form. And so they created the GNU software set. And if you want to learn more about it, you can go to their website. Let me get back into my machine here. Uh, you know the the GNU project. It's gnu.org, You can go to their site and you can learn a lot more about what they do. But they have the GNU Software collection, and it's made up of a ton of the commands. In fact, almost every command we're going to see throughout the whole rest of this series comes from GNU. And what happens is people will take the GNU software and they'll package that with the Linux kernel, and then they'll distribute that out as what's called a Linux distribution. So you got to combine the kernel with the software, and all that together now gives you that full kind of Linux solution. Now, if you look, you'll actually see. Whoops, if I can stay in my web browser here, there's a link over here to view some of the GNU Linux distributions that are out there. And when you click on it, you'll actually see a bunch of names that you probably don't recognize, distributions that are not very popular. And that's because at GNU, they're absolutely focused on free. So if you want to be a part of that organization, it has to be 100% truly free. And most Linux operating systems actually aren't truly free. There's little variations. There might be drivers that are included that are closed source. And so, we lose the freedom side of things. There's various aspects like that can break that. But they work very hard for that. You'll notice they, join the Free Software Foundation. That whole movement is very important to them. They actually have their own operating system called GNU Herd, which was developed off of a different kernel back in the old days that was kind of a competitor to Linux early on, but Linux is the one that won out. And so today, that's the kernel that we all hear about.
So who combines GNU with Linux then?
The cop out answer on this would be anybody who wants to.
Hey.
If you want to do it, you can. When you combine the GNU software with the Linux kernel, you're creating a Linux distribution, right? An operating system that you can now share with other people, and anybody can do it. You can go and download the Linux kernel right now. You can go and download the GNU software, or you don't even have to do that. You can go and get some other software set. You can build your own software tools, put them together, and release them. Those are the Linux distributions, and there's a ton of them. And just to give you a little bit of scope, there's a website called DistroWatch. And DistroWatch does a really cool thing. They try and track all the different Linux distributions that are out there, which ones are the most popular, which ones have come and gone, and so on. And they have some neat diagrams on their site. One of them that I always get a kick out of is the periodic table of Linux distros, where they've kind of assigned letter abbreviations to some of the major distros. But the best is this diagram right here, what's called the Linux family tree.
Oh
And
my.
they've mapped it out because what will happen is somebody will create a distro, and then somebody will take that distribution and branch that out and change it. It's kind of a family tree. And looking at this, I know it's all really small right now, but each of those colored lines is representing a different Linux distribution. There are hundreds of them. Some are very, very popular. Some are only run by 5 or 6 people. Some have died away and aren't around anymore. Some have been around for over 20 years, right? So a number of different ones. Let me kind of zoom in a little bit on these. One thing you might notice looking at it is that there's several spots where you'll see a single distro has branched out into a number of, they're called forks or derivatives. And when we look, there's a couple of big players in the Linux world. This one right here is listed as Fedora. All right. Fedora is from a company called Red Hat. Red Hat actually has a commercial Linux product that we're going to see throughout this series.
It's very popular.
And Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL, that's their main commercial product, very stable. Fedora is like their test bed. They test new and exciting features there, and only when they've tested out as functional do they move it into their main distro. Well, a number of other Linux distributions have basically forked off of Fedora. And some of these might be popular. Some of these you may have never heard of. A lot of them, see how they trail off. So maybe the project's died away. There's no supporter for it. But others continue on, like here, Blag. I've never heard of Blag. But the line goes on through to today, so it's still an actively supported distro. So they'll come and go. So that one's Fedora. But even here, Fedora is not original because it originated from Red Hat. If we follow that purple line down a bit and see where it comes from, right down here, we can see Red Hat.
Mhm.
And in this show, we're going to be using an operating system called CentOS. And CentOS is a derivative of Red Hat. So we'll find that one forked off here somewhere. There it is. So there's CentOS. And it spreads along. And a number of operating systems have branched off of that as well. So Red Hat's obviously a big player in this space. Another one is Debian. Notice there's a ton branching off of this one entry. Debian is probably the most forked, it's a weird thing to say, operating system that's out there. With Debian, which is just short for the original creator's name, Deborah and Ian. It was a couple. They created that operating system called it Debian, and it's GNU tools packaged with the Linux kernel and in a number of other pieces of software. That one has always been a favorite of programmers because it stayed fairly light. They didn't force a bunch of tools and bloat on you. They kept it pretty straightforward, and it was very stable, very well supported. So a lot of people branched off of it. One of the most famous branches, you probably noticed up a bit, there was one branch. Whoop, I'm having scrolling issues here. There was one branch that branched even more. Where did it go? Here, this one. So this is a derivative of Debian called Ubuntu. And
Mm-hmm.
Ubuntu is the most popular desktop Linux distro right now. So it changes, from year to year. But right now on the desktop, Ubuntu is definitely winning the war. They've got the most installs. On the server side, it's a little bit different. You see a lot more Debian, RHEL, SUSE Linux, and a few others that are in that space on the server side, and a lot of Ubuntu servers too. But on the desktop side, it's not even a competition. They're definitely winning the war there. So these are all different distributions. All of these are different people or different companies that chose to put that software together and distribute it out as Linux. They're all technically running the Linux kernel. They're all very similar, but because they choose different software to sit on top of it, they can actually look very different moving from one system to another.
So, Don, how do we pick which distribution to run? There are so many of them.
There's a ton, and there's not like one answer to this. I can't say, well, you fill out this checklist and you'll know which distro to
Hmm.
run. What I always recommend to people is try several of them out, see which one you like, and what you'll probably find is that it's not a one size fits all. For me, if I'm dealing with enterprise work, if I'm doing something I'm being paid to do and I need it to be stable and rock solid, I always go Red Hat. Red Hat Enterprise Linux on my servers. That's kind of the way to go for anything that I put my reputation on, right? But if it's a hobby project, or if I'm just bringing up a server for myself, or it's something that I don't necessarily worry too much about, I'll do CentOS because it's free. All right, Red Hat you have to pay for. CentOS is free. On the desktop side, though, I usually go back and forth between Ubuntu and Fedora. I love Ubuntu because of the software support. Every vendor out there supports Ubuntu. I love Fedora because it has a lot of cool features and it's got some better package management and some other things. So even for me, there's like 4 or 5 different distros that I move between, even in a single day. I'll move between different distros on different systems that I use. You might go a little different. You might say, you know what? I just love SUSE Linux. It's stable. It's got the features I want. It's got a cool name. I'm gonna go with that. And you use it on your servers and your desktops. You use it everywhere. You can certainly do that. There's not really a wrong choice on this. Well, let me clarify. There is a wrong choice if you pick a distro that is not widely supported or that is no longer being supported. So distros die off, right? These are usually people who are not being paid that create the distros. And so every now and then they'll just say, I'm done working on that. Well, security exploits come out. And if it's not being patched and updated, you don't want to be running that operating system. There's also other ones that are just not widely supported. So, for example, Arch Linux. Arch Linux is very popular. People really like it because it gives you full control of everything. You compile every single package for it, which is honestly a super pain in the butt. It's really hard to do. So, if you're running that in a workplace and something goes wrong, it's hard to find people that are trained in Arch Linux that are ready to get in there and be comfortable with it and work with it. Versus if you had picked something like Debian or Red Hat, it's easy to find people that are comfortable with that to get in to support the product. So these are all things you have to weigh as you make a decision on which distro you want to run. But there's a ton of them. A lot of them are all built off of that same architecture, so you get the same performance. So then it just boils down to personal preference, which one you like.
Well, then, which distributions should we be familiar with for the exam? That's the question of the day.
Absolutely. So you certainly don't have to learn all 100 or several hundred of these.
Well, that's good.
The exam is based on 2 distros. There's Ubuntu that I mentioned
Mhm.
and CentOS. And honestly, in real life, if you learn Ubuntu, then you'll be perfectly at home on Debian or Linux Mint or whatever because they're all in that same architecture. And if you learn CentOS, you'll be perfectly at home on Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Fedora, even SUSE to a big extent because they're all kind of off that same common core. So for the exam, Ubuntu and CentOS. You may love a different distro and run that normally, but those are the 2 that you need to focus on for the exam.
Introduction to Linux, another wonderful episode. Before we move on, I think you have something else you'd like to say, yes?
Yeah, this episode was a little light. I know
It
we didn't
was. It was
really get
like
into like commands and all that.
overview.
That's all going to be starting in the next episode, but it's important to understand the history and the design methodology that goes behind all this
Mhm.
before we dive into it. So stay tuned. We are going to be jumping into our command line in the next episode and really getting into the nitty gritty beyond this.
That's right. There's a lot more for CompTIA Linux Plus. Don's doing a great job getting some information that you will need for that inevitable exam. And don't forget about the supplementary information in our course library that will help you be even more successful. So check that out too. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is binge worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.